Okay. So again, we're talking about economic systems and businesses. We learned about the basic formula that you use to calculate profit. What is that formula? Tell me. How do we determine profit?
Revenue minus cost equal profit.
Exactly. The revenue, which is the income we earn from selling our product or service. So basically, it's our sales minus our costs equals our profit. So that's key, right? Any company that is not making a profit eventually is not going to be sustainable. We looked at some of the different factors that go into production of products and services. So companies use these, maybe not all five, but they always use some of these in order to make their product or service. And we talked about how important entrepreneurs are because they help create new businesses, offering new products and services. So that creates innovation, creates competition, it creates jobs. These companies pay taxes. So there are a lot of benefits that come from entrepreneurship. Then we looked at the internal and external environments of businesses. And I told you about SWOT analysis, right? I explained that, excuse me, I got a little bit of a throat thing today, a little bit of a scratchy throat. I told you that the internal elements of the business can be analyzed in terms of the strengths and weaknesses. So what are the company's strengths, the things it does well? What are its weaknesses, the areas where it doesn't do so well, right? So it's important to identify that so you can make an appropriate strategic plan, right? If you ignore your weaknesses, your competitors are going to step all over you. So you have to have a way to address those weaknesses. But there are also the opportunities and threats that exist outside the company. Opportunities to sell your product or service, maybe create a new product, maybe expand into a new market, and threats like competitors or economic changes. So by analyzing the internal strengths and weaknesses, the external opportunities and threats, the company can come up with an appropriate strategy. We talked about what demographics are, the way that we study groups of people, right? And that can be really useful for companies in figuring out who is their target customer, who's most likely to buy their product, and how do you communicate with that particular demographic, that particular group of people. Let's see, what's an example of that? Now the Super Bowl came to mind, which triggered my thought of Taylor Swift, right?
They had a shooting yesterday.
I heard about that. I did hear about that, Eric. That it's tragic. But if we just take Taylor Swift as an example, she's an economy unto herself. But I understand she's a billionaire now because how much people spend on her music and her concerts. And she appeals to Swifties, you know, in a certain segment of the population. I've tried to understand like what the appeal is. I've listened to her music. It's okay. Personally, I don't see it. You know, but hey, that's me. I'm not in her target demographic, right? And that doesn't mean you have to be male to like Taylor. I mean, female to like Taylor Swift, or what? She has a lot of male fans. Doesn't mean you have to be young. She has some older fans. But not every product or service appeals to every person, right? So through demographics, we can identify who is that group. Who are the Swifties, right? And what's the best way to communicate with them if you're Taylor Swift trying to sell your music to them. So that's why demographics are really key, especially when we get to marketing. We have 2 chapters on marketing, and we'll talk more about demographics. We looked at the difference between capitalism, socialism, and communism, the difference between macro and microeconomics. Which one is where you look at a national economy as a whole? Macro, right? Macro means big, micro means small. So micro is looking at the impact of economics on individual companies. We talked about how the US is capitalist leaning, not completely capitalist, because we do have quite a bit of regulation of businesses, which limits what they are able to sell and to whom they're able to sell their products in some cases. So we don't have a completely free market. Some elements of our economy are socialized, believe it or not. Right? There are some things that are not only our federal government, but our state governments and our local governments provide to us that are paid for by taxes, right? So we chip in for different types of taxes, we get certain services back. That's basically socialism. If everything was controlled by governments, that would be communism, right? The communist system, the government really controls the means of production. And there's no entrepreneurship in a communist system. There's no really competition. I think I probably mentioned to you, I lived in the former Soviet Union after the Soviet Union had collapsed. This was between 1992 and 1994. And just to give you an idea, because they were still, even though at that point they were no longer the Soviet Union, they were still operating in the same way. There wasn't a lot of competition of small businesses and entrepreneurship. And so I remember, for example, going to the store close to where my wife and I lived. We actually lived in a city you might have heard of, Ukraine. I'm sorry, Ukraine's country, Kherson in Ukraine. They don't use a lot because of the fighting there. So we lived in Kherson. That's where her parents lived as well. And we'd go to the store to buy some food. And you'd walk into the store, and usually they had only one product. Like today, they've got eggs. Tomorrow, maybe they have cheese. And that's what you buy. I remember the water would get shut off sometimes just at random times. Everything was controlled really by the government still, because the Russian people and the Ukrainian people hadn't quite figured out how to start businesses, how to compete. So a few did. And unfortunately, a lot of the resources that used to be controlled by governments, once they said, we're going to go to a market-based economy and not have the government control everything, a handful of people stepped in and took over factories, took over means of production, and they are now the oligarchs, the wealthy people that are really controlling the Russian economy and the Ukrainian economy, more so Russian. But that's not really a market-based economy. That's closer to organized crime. And so unfortunately, after the fall of the Soviet Union, instead of transitioning to something like our economy and our political system, it transitioned into a dictatorship where Putin has been in power since 2000, been in power for more than 23 years. Keeps getting re-elected. People don't really have much of a choice except to vote for him. And the economy there, although it's thriving, they do have a lot of really wealthy people, and they do have a growing middle class, especially in the big cities. It's not, there's a lot of poverty over there, and there's a lot of corruption. So unfortunately, they didn't transition into a market-based democratic system. They really transitioned into a dictatorship. So I hope that gives you an idea of these different forms of business. Again, communism is on the decline in the world. Socialism and market-based capitalist economies are growing. People are looking at that as a better solution than the communist approach. Any questions or comments? Okay.
Where would Russia be on the
Russia now? That's a good question. As far as their economy, I would say they're probably capitalist leaning. It's just because you can start a business there. The thing is, because of the corruption, it's really more of what's called an oligarchy, where you have a few strong business leaders of maybe like 100 for the whole country to really control the whole economy. And not like here where, in theory, anybody could start a business and you have competition, but you have the right to grow your business and not have to deal with the mafia, right? There, unfortunately, their economy is really controlled by the mafia. So it is market based, but corrupt. Is it like direct control or? It's pretty direct. So I would say, like, for example, these different oligarchs in Russia, each one controls a different industry. So, for example, there's one person that they basically control all of the aluminum production in the country. Somebody else is over, basically all the oil. Somebody else maybe over all the textiles. And so it limits the ability of other people to really compete. But from what I understand, these oligarchs all have to kick back some of that money to Putin. That's what gives him the power to stay in control. So hopefully that gives you a little idea of the real life application of some of these concepts. So, okay, yes, I'm sorry. That's all right.
Could the United States have these views on solar?
Well, I mean, there is corruption here, but the corruption doesn't tend to dominate an entire industry. So, for example, maybe maybe you open a bank. You could open a bank if you had the right financing, you had the right experience, you could open a bank. And you're free to do that. And there's probably not another bank that's going to come and say, hey, you need to give us some of your money or else we're going to shoot you. No, that's probably not going to happen because we are primarily a nation of laws. Whereas in Russia, that could happen. So that kind of limits competition. Okay. Didn't really plan to talk that much about Russia, but it is, with everything going on in the world, you do have to pay attention to what's happening in Russia. There was just within the last couple of days, there was this announcement that Russia has plans to create some sort of a space-based nuclear weapon that can shoot down our satellites. They haven't done it yet, but they're working towards that. That's a scary thing. If they shoot down our satellites, there goes our internet connection. A lot of the data that we have access to actually does rely on satellite communications. I saw a hand over here.
Did you watch the recent interview with
Putin?
Yeah.
No, I didn't. I heard little clips of it, but no. Did you watch it?
No.
Yeah. I don't have a lot of interest in what Putin has to say because I think he's just a dictator.
Yeah, that's true.
And I don't think what he says today would be anything really different than what I've heard him say in the past. So, okay. And then we talked about the three major sectors of the US economy: governments, households, and companies, how they, all transfer money to one another through financial institutions. And this was where we stopped.
Yes.
I think I ran out of time here on number 3, but I talked about how economic changes go in cycles, right? So even though an economy, if the population is growing, the economy is going to grow, it doesn't do so smoothly. And it goes through fits and starts where goes forward, comes back a little bit, but in general, the trend will be upwards. And we talked a little bit about how we use the unemployment rate excuse me, to measure how many people are working or looking for work. That goes up and down. We use the consumer price index and other similar indices, but mainly the CPI or consumer price index to measure inflation. And that also goes up and down. And what else? Oh, GDP. GDP, we also look at how much we produce. That also varies. Now, let's talk about this inflation idea. If demand increases, just going back to a Taylor Swift example, if more people start to become Swifties, that increases demand for her music, for her concerts, right? And she could, if she wanted to, then charge more money. More people want things, the more you can charge, because there are more people willing to pay that extra money. Maybe not everybody, but companies often will raise their prices when demand increases. But another reason that companies might raise their prices is if their costs go up. So if Taylor Swift finds that she has to spend more on security, more on transportation, more on her dancers and her musicians, if those costs go up for her, she might have to raise the prices of her tickets in order to maintain the same level of profitability. So inflation can be caused by an increase in demand or an increase in the company's costs. Okay. Any comments, any questions? All right, so that was our not so quick review, but let's get into some new concepts. Monetary policy versus fiscal policy. Do you remember when we talked about the Federal Reserve? Yeah. That's the central bank of the United States. And they can control interest rates. They can control how much money banks are able to lend out. And in doing so, they help to either speed up the economy if it's growing too slowly, or slow down the economy if it's growing too quickly. And what was the problem with an economy? God bless you. What's the problem with an economy growing too quickly? Inflation. Yeah, inflation. So if we have too much inflation, like we really have had a lot of inflation the last year or so, the Federal Reserve kept raising interest rates, and it worked. It helped to slow down the inflation. I was kind of concerned that they were raising it too fast, but they haven't crashed the economy so far. We haven't gone into a recession, so it seems to have worked out pretty well. So again, monetary policy comes from the Federal Reserve, and it's designed to either slow down or speed up the economy. Who can tell me what fiscal policy is? Are you familiar? Fiscal policy? That comes from the federal government. Remember that the Federal Reserve is not part of the federal government, right? These are privately owned banks. The president of the United States gets to appoint who they want to be the chairperson of the Federal Reserve, and then Congress has to approve it. That's really the only control that the president has over the Federal Reserve. However, the president is in charge of the executive branch of the federal government and gets to set fiscal policy, which basically is excuse me, the tax rates and government spending. So that's how the federal government can influence the economy. For example, when the Great Depression happened in the 1930s, one thing FDR did, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he created all these programs to create jobs where he hired artists to go out and make art. He hired people to go out and build new bridges and roads and things like that. And by taking that federal money and using it to create jobs, well, that gave people more money that they could spend, and that money made its way through the economy. And that helped us get out of the Great Depression. So increasing government spending is a way to help stimulate the economy. There's actually a name for it. If you've taken economics, Keynesian economics or Keynesian, I don't remember which, is that approach. Okay, so however, sometimes the federal government spends more than they bring in tax revenues. And we know that for businesses, that's a problem, right? You need to bring in more money than you're spending. The federal government, though, can kind of get away with that because they could print more money if they want to. And they can borrow money. This slide here says we have $31 trillion in national debt. That's actually now outdated. That was from, I think, last semester that I looked it up. It's actually already 34 trillion. $34 trillion is our national debt. So that's money that our federal government owes to investors. Those investors, some of them are US investors, some are Japanese, Chinese investors, and other countries that have bought US bonds. So that's a lot of debt, right? And that is a concern. This graphic that I included here shows where some of that debt has come from. This goes up to 2020, I believe, or 2019. And so we can see some of the sources of debt. The light blue color here, this is from the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those cost trillions of dollars. And you could argue, what did we get out of that? I don't know. It's debatable. President George W. Bush lowered taxes, especially on the wealthy and businesses. And you can see that then, if you lower taxes, that's less money coming in. And so then you have to borrow more money. In 2008, we had a major financial crisis. That's a whole topic by itself. And our economy almost collapsed in 2008. Fortunately, it dropped. It was really bad, but it didn't completely collapse. We didn't go into a depression, but it was very expensive. You can see the economic recovery, bailing out the Wall Street banks. Those are these red and kind of greenish colors. That's where some of that debt came from. What is that? Oh, and the economic downturn in general. We had to borrow a lot of money for that. See, and then the gray part is just other reasons that we had to borrow money. So you can see some of the things that have gone into the multi-trillion-dollar debt that our economy has. All right, let's go ahead and we'll cover this slide and then we'll pause and do our grow activity. What we see here is where the federal income comes from. This is as of 2020, so I should probably get a newer chart. But let's go ahead and take a look at it anyways. So as of 2020, the money coming into the federal government, their revenue, came in large part from our individual income taxes. So when we work and money gets taken out of our paycheck for federal income taxes, or we have to send in extra money when we do our taxes, that goes to the federal government. And that is a large portion of the federal government's income. The other large portion is payroll taxes. That also comes out of our paycheck. And part of it is paid for by our employer. So basically half comes from us and half from our employer. And that is the other large source of income. Look at the corporate income tax as of 2020. Pretty small in comparison, right? So that's kind of interesting. I know since that time, under the Biden administration, a new minimum corporate income tax was passed So corporations are supposed to be paying at least 15% of their profits now. But of course, they have loopholes and ways that they can try to get around paying some of their taxes. And then we've got other taxes. So that's where the federal money comes from. Any questions or comments? Yes.
So you said the 15%, is that like, because corporations get double tax, so is that like off their revenue?
That would just be on the corporation's tax. So any dividends that they pay to the investors would also get taxed separately.
And that's what the 15% would affect that too, or just?
No, 50% is just for the corporation's tax. The dividends, when you get those, you pay tax just together with the rest of your income. So whatever is your normal income tax rate. Okay, and then let's see where the money goes. Let's see, I think I have to move this around. Oh, you know what? I'll just do this. Okay, so I know this is a little bit small, but this is where the federal government spends its money. Again, this is as of 2020, so some of this has changed. But you see, excuse me, a large portion goes to Social Security and Medicare. Those are programs we pay into. Those payroll taxes that we pay help fund Social Security and Medicare, so that when you become eligible for Social Security and Medicare, you get that money back, either in the form of direct payments or health insurance, or both. So that's a big part of the federal spending for those two programs. There's also Medicaid, which is health insurance for mostly people that are lower income and can't get other health care. Let's see, then we have defense. We have the largest military in the world, so obviously that's pretty expensive. Non-defense includes health, transportation, education, veterans benefits, housing assistance, and other activities. So a lot of the services that we get from the federal government fall into this category. Now, there are a couple things here that are specifically related to the pandemic, because part of how we got out of the economic downturn related to the pandemic was the federal government started spending a lot of money. They were giving money to companies to help them pay their employees, even while they were shut down and not able to operate. Fortunately, there was a lot of fraud in that program, and they're still trying to clean that up and get some of that money back from the corporations that or businesses that got that money and then didn't give it to their employees. Instead, they spent it on something else. So we do have some corruption in our country as well, unfortunately. That one would be corruption by the business owners. And then let's see, unemployment compensation. When you get laid off and you apply for unemployment insurance, you do that through the state. In California, it's the EDD, or Employment Development Department. And then if you are approved, they'll send you money while you're looking for a job, right? We call that unemployment. During the pandemic, for a lot of people, their state unemployment ran out, but the federal government was adding and giving them extra money. So a lot of that was federal spending during the pandemic for unemployment. And then, remember, the federal government was also sending checks, just stimulus checks to individuals to help stimulate the economy. So these were some of the things the federal government did to spend money, stimulate the economy, and it worked. Our economy's been roaring ever since. What's that? Rebounding, yeah. There was a special program where they were sending money to families with kids, and that helped lift a lot of kids out of poverty. Unfortunately, that program did not get extended, so some of those kids are back in poverty at this point. So anyways, that's where the money comes from and goes for our federal government. Any comments or questions? Okay, well, let's switch over to the grow activities. So go ahead and get in your groups. And we'll work on that for about 10 minutes. you might recall that Hurricane Katrina came up before. It was a pretty devastating hurricane for New Orleans. I might have already mentioned to you, the reason it was so devastating is because the hurricane dropped a lot of water into Lake Pontchartrain, which sits above the city of New Orleans. And when the levees couldn't hold the water back and the levees failed, water came flooding down into the city, flooding entire neighborhoods, and people had to escape out of the roofs of their homes because the water was up to the second story. And so it was a pretty big disaster. You can see a picture here of what some of that looked like, where homes were almost completely flooded. And the reason this is coming up again is so we can think a little bit about these sort of natural disasters and the impact on prices. So imagine a natural disaster happens and you go to the store to buy some water because you can't drink the water at home because of the flooding, it's contaminated. So you go to the store to get some water. And you see that a bottle of water that maybe would have been $2 before, the store is now charging $20. That might seem unfair, right? But they're price gouging. They're charging all this extra money just because there's a limited supply and a lot of demand. And so they raise the price. And you think, hey, that's not fair. I need the water. I don't want to pay $20. Do you agree that that seems unfair? I agree it seems unfair. But there is another way to look at it. What would happen if the store kept the price at the normal amount, $2 for a bottle, and you went in there, you might think, you know what, I'm just going to buy like 10 bottles, right? You might hoard because you don't know when you're going to be able to get water again. And then the person coming in behind you, maybe there's no water for them. So maybe by raising the price, it causes you to only buy the water you need, leaving more for other people. So you can argue either way, right? You could say that the invisible hand of the market should be allowed to work, and then everything kind of smooths out on its own. So price should be able to fluctuate based on supply and demand. But you could also argue that that's not fair. Maybe you don't have 20 bucks, right? Maybe it's not fair to you that the invisible hand of the market raised the price on the water. Any thoughts? What would be a better solution? Other than leaving it at $2 or raising it at $20, is there another way we could better handle this situation? Perfect. Great. You could leave the price at $2, but then say that you can only buy 2 bottles at a time, okay, or something like that, right? And we experienced that a little bit during the pandemic. Did you go to the store and find you could only buy a couple rolls of paper towels at a time and things like that? And that probably is the fairest way to address something like that. Okay, let's get into supply and demand curves. So this is as close as we're going to get to math in this whole semester. So let me just explain how this works. If we have a company that makes jackets for snowboarders, okay? We have this chart here, and we've got quantity of jackets on the bottom x-axis, and then on the y-axis over here, we've got the price of the jackets. So you can imagine if we charged more than $150 per jacket, not that many people are going to be willing to pay that much, right? That's kind of a lot to spend on a jacket, in my opinion. Maybe my wife would have a different opinion about that, but I think that would be a lot. And as the price came down, imagine that that jacket was $35. Well, then a lot more people would be willing to buy it. You see, we've got 1,200 buyers here at that lower price with only about 200 at the higher price. So this is called the demand curve. As the price goes down, demand tends to go up. Here's a supply curve. As a company If we can only charge $35, we're not gonna be too excited about selling these jackets, because we're not making a whole lot of profit. So maybe we'll make a couple hundred, but we don't want to spend all of our time and energy on this product. On the other hand, if we could charge more than $150, then we want to make a lot of those jackets. We'll make as many as we can because they're so profitable. Okay. So you see how the supply curve goes the opposite way, right? The demand curve went that way, supply curve goes that way. Now, if we put them together, in the middle, we get the equilibrium point. This is where supply equals demand. Now, that's a useful thing to know. That tells us that, hey, if we set the price at $80, we would be selling 700 jackets. That's kind of a sweet spot where it's very profitable and we can sell a large amount. And maybe that's the right strategy. But if we are a luxury clothing brand, maybe lowering our price to $80 kind of cheapens our brand image. If we're Gucci or Coach or something, I don't know if Coach makes jackets, maybe Yves Saint Laurent or something. We might want to charge a higher price to keep that luxury brand image, right? On the other hand, if we're Walmart and we're known for low prices, we're okay with a lower price because we know the volume that we're going to sell is enough that we will still make a big profit. So depending on your marketing strategy, you might justify a lower or higher price, but having this information helps you know where the equilibrium point is, and you know that that's where the majority of your competitors are going to set their prices. Okay, so those are called the supply and demand curves. Any questions on that concept? Okay. As I mentioned, if demand increases, the price is, or actually, if the demand increases and the price stays the same, then the number of jackets we sell will increase. And if demand decreases, all of a sudden people decide they don't like snowboarding or they don't like snowboarding jackets. So if demand decreases and the price stays the same, then the number that we sell will go down. Okay. And this goes back to Adam Smith. You might have heard about him. He was an economist and philosopher really in Scotland hundreds of years ago. And a lot of the US's economic system is based on the ideas of Adam Smith. He was the one that talked about this invisible hand of the market that sets prices based on supply and demand. Now, you could say, God bless you, you could say that that's why capitalism is great, because if you just let people make and buy and sell whatever they want, then the prices will automatically adjust. And if there's a shortage of some good, some company will come and make that good. And if there's too much of another good, then companies will switch to a different product. And all of this is just going to naturally happen based on these market forces, the invisible hand of the market. But if there's no regulation at all on the market, then what happens is the wealthy companies tend to get wealthier, and it makes it harder for the smaller companies to compete. So that's why we have found that we do need some regulation, even in a capitalist market-based economy. Okay, let's go on to this new concept. So you're probably all familiar with the game Monopoly, right? Pretty well known. And what does it mean, monopoly? What's the meaning of that word? Everything. Okay, yeah. So if you have a monopoly, you control an entire industry. There are basically no companies that can compete with you. And in a market-based economy like ours, we don't like that, right? We realize that that's giving too much power to one company. So we do regulate and prevent companies from becoming monopolies. There was a time AT&T was the dominant phone company in the whole country. And the Department of Justice, part of the federal government, came in and said, sorry, AT&T, you're too powerful. We're going to split you up into multiple smaller companies. They did the same thing with, I think it was US Steel. Anyways, it's happened to a lot of companies where they got broken up. There's been talk about maybe breaking up Microsoft at times. T-Mobile. Well, you bring up an interesting point, Eric. AT&T was going to buy T-Mobile, and AT&T had invested $1 billion into that deal. Gave all this money to T-Mobile to help them get ready to be acquired, build up their infrastructure. But then the Department of Justice stepped in and said, sorry, AT&T, if you buy T-Mobile, you're going to be too powerful. We're not going to let this deal go through. And T-Mobile, from what I understand, got to basically keep the $1 billion, but did not get acquired. So in general, we do not like monopolies because that gives too much power to one company. Now, there is an exception. Can anybody give me an example where we do allow economies in our economic system?
Like monopolies?
Yeah.
PG,
PG.
the only electrical company in America.
Well, not in America, but in this part of California, that they are the only one. So that is correct. Utility companies, because they run pipes and wires into our homes and our businesses, it wouldn't be practical for them to have a lot of competitors also running these pipes and wires into our homes and businesses. So we allow utility companies to be the only company that serves a particular area. And this includes gas, electricity, I'm talking natural gas, electricity, what else? Cable, telephone service, water, yes, water. These are all examples of utilities. So we allow companies to operate as monopolies. However, they're heavily regulated. In California, the California Public Utilities Commission oversees these monopolies and says whether or not they can raise their rates, whether or not they're providing an acceptable level of service. Now with PG&E, they've not done a very good job, right?
No.
They have a lot of safety issues. There have been deaths attributed to their negligence. Wildfires, gas explosions that PG&E caused. So yeah, that's a monopoly that we probably need to regulate better, right? But other than utilities, we really do not allow monopolies in this country. We do end up sometimes having oligopolies, which is kind of a funny word. Kind of sounds like oligarch because it comes from the same root. An oligopoly is when there are really only just a few companies that dominate that industry. So an example that comes to mind is if you have a cell phone, it's probably either using Apple's operating system or Android. Does anybody have a cell phone that uses a different operating system than those two? There used to be the Windows phone. Those aren't around anymore. BlackBerry was popular for a while, but pretty much now we all use one or the other. So I would say that's an oligopoly as far as control of the operating systems for cell phones. And I think Android, isn't that really something Google developed? Yeah. So that's basically you have a Google operating system or you have an Apple operating system on your phone. Okay. So maybe we need a little more competition in that area. If there are multiple firms competing in an industry, that's called monopolistic competition. So it sounds like monopoly. An example might be if you think about the clothing industry, there are lots and lots of different companies, and just retailers, right? Who are some clothing retailers out there? H&M, Adidas, okay, that's true. Not just shoes; they have others. We can go on and on, right? Forever 21, Banana Republic, all of these are different clothing retailers. Macy's. So these are all in the same industry, right? but they're very different. They differentiate themselves.
They come from the same firm.
Some of them are owned by the
Yeah,
same firm.
like,
That's true. That's
Gap,
true.
Old Navy,
That's true.
Athleta,
Yeah.
it's the same.
Yeah, L Brands
yeah,
too owns
so
a
the
whole
same
bunch of different
firm.
brands. That's true. That's true. But even when a company owns multiple brands, they differentiate those brands. Say, you know, this one is for women, this one's for men, this one's for old people, this one's for younger people. So what they're doing in that general industry of clothing and fashion is there are many firms, and each one kind of has a monopoly in its own little target area, right? So if you want to buy, like, I guess, hip, goth kind of stuff, you're going to go to Hot Topic, right? Probably because that's what they're known for, right? They kind of have a monopoly in that niche. But then in some industries, you get products where there really is no differentiation. These would be commodities, things like gold or oil or even agricultural products, cotton or soybeans. The products are pretty much identical between companies, right? You got this cotton company, pretty much make the same product. So when you have that sort of situation, you got lots and lots of companies competing. That's called perfect competition. But that raises a question, why is this perfect competition rare? So even something like coffee beans. Is there a difference in coffee beans from, let's say, Central America versus from Africa or Sumatra? It's a little different, right? So yeah, it is pretty much the same product, but there is still a little bit of ability to differentiate. So it's rare that we have a product that is so consistent that the only thing that people can compete on is having a lower price. Like even oil, there are different grades of oil. There's sweet, crude, and different kinds. But if you have a type of oil that's identical to this other company's type of oil, all you can really compete on would be price, because the product is the same. But that's pretty rare. Okay, any questions on those different types of market structures? Okay. All right, our last slide, and then we will do our matching activity. So we've talked about how in the workplace, we have people from many different cultures and ethnic backgrounds, and how that adds to the capabilities of the organization. It's a good thing, but you have to get familiar with people's different cultures, right? You have to know how to communicate and interact well. Well, the same thing is true of different generations. Today, because people are living longer than they used to, God bless you, and working longer, some people are not retiring until they're in their 70s or even 80s. We have, in some situations, 4 generations working side by side in the same company. So you could be working next to somebody who's old enough to be your great grandparent in some cases. And this creates opportunities because we can learn from each other, but it also creates challenges, right? In values and communication and so forth. So that is a trend in today's economy. There is increasing demand for energy around the world as you have countries that are developing. They're trying to go from being basically poor countries to being wealthier countries to having advanced economies. Well, they need more energy to run their factories and build their roads and everything. So, excuse me, if they're using fossil fuels, that's a problem. Because we know that fossil fuels have been causing climate change. They're the major factor contributing to climate change. And we know we need to do something about that. We need to reduce the use of fossil fuels and clean up some of the damage that's already been done. So the world is shifting away from fossil fuels and more towards cleaner, renewable sources of energy like wind and solar. And it's gotten to the point where wind and solar are cheaper now than fossil fuels. So that's good. That means it'll be easier for these developing nations and the already developed nations to transition and use less fossil fuels. But that's a major issue today. And it's impacting economies because especially think about the economies that rely on oil. Russia relies on selling oil. That's a major export for them, probably the major export. Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, these are countries that rely on oil, and if people stop buying their oil, they're going to have to transition. Saudi Arabia has already started that process. They've tried to get away from depending too much on oil revenue, and they created the sovereign wealth fund to invest in companies all around the world as an alternative way to make money. But take a country like Venezuela, Russia, their economies are still pretty dependent on oil, in Russia's case, natural gas as well. And, they're going to have to find a different answer. Otherwise, there's going to be chaos in those countries, even more than there already is. And we've talked about the global economy, right? The trading between countries, imports and exports. That trend is continuing. We're relying more on being able to buy and sell from other countries, but some technologies like 3D printing is allowing us to do things more cheaply, where we can maybe make some things in the United States that we used to import. We can go back, like computer chips. We've gotten completely away from making computer chips in this country, but under the CHIPS Act that was passed a couple years ago, a lot of companies in the United States are now investing in making computer chips again. But the overall trend is more international trade. Okay, so with the remaining time, we've got 9 minutes, good. Let's look at these 8 learning objectives and 8 images and try to match them up. So go ahead and take a minute or two to think about that.
PlayStation 2
We'll see what you think.
PlayStation 2 cover.
Yeah, so think about which learning objective that might relate to over here.
PS2 best-selling console.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, the first one talks about our standard of living, how both for-profit and non-profit businesses influence our standard of living. Which image do you think is a good match for that?
I think that's the Federal Reserve for one of them. So that nonprofit, all those ones are there. By increasing your standard of living.
Okay. Well, they can by with the Federal Reserve by controlling, the monetary
Makes sense.
policy, they can help create more jobs, believe it or not, and they can also help slow down inflation. So yeah, that has an impact on standard of living. How about the internal and external elements of the business environment? Strengths and weaknesses, the opportunities and threats. A good match for that. Yes. Okay. So tell me what you're thinking there. Okay. If you have a monopoly, that means you really have no competition, right? So that is a strength for you, and it reduces your threats. So yeah, I can see that. Then let's see. How about the three sectors of the US economy? Remember, those were households, governments, and businesses. Top right, okay. Right, yeah, well, those are people, right? They represent households, but they probably work in businesses and governments. Let's see, how about how we measure the nation's economic health? Yes,
I would say the one where it has like places going imports and
Okay.
exports.
okay, imports and exports. Balance of trade was a concept from our globalization chapter where we measure how much we import from a particular country versus how much we export. And as we know, with China, for example, we import a lot more from them than we actually sell back to them. How about monetary and fiscal policy? It's a good match. What's that, Karina?
This one.
You get this one?
Yeah,
Okay, and why do you pick that one?
because we pay our taxes
Okay,
and we can improve.
okay, we get services back.
Yeah,
Okay, so we pay taxes to the federal government, we get different,
the money they go to back to the education, for the doctors,
okay?
yeah.
Yeah.
Because the person they don't have insurance.
Yeah, we can, they're public health,
Uh-huh.
public education, things like that. Okay, supply and demand. Thoughts? First one? This one?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that could be supply and demand, right? Products being supplied to other parts of
And
the
this
world.
one too,
What's that?
the oil, the petroleum,
This one here?
yeah.
Okay, yeah, you also see different resources being supplied. All right, market structure. That's what we were just talking about, like monopolies, oligopolies. Probably connect that one to the PlayStation one, right? Because this is the Monopoly game. The last one would be trends. So let's see what images we didn't really talk about. We see some people here filling up what looks like water jugs. You know, fortunately, we live in a society where we have water piped into our homes. We don't have to go collect it at some central location. We see maybe this is artificial intelligence. That is definitely impacting economies around the world by automating a lot of things we used to do. I think that's it. I think we used all of them. All right. Any final comments or questions, Eric?
No.
No. All right. Well, we are a few minutes early today, so enjoy your extra minutes. Have a good rest of the week, everybody. I'll see you on Tuesday.
Thank you.
Okay, have a good one.